I don't know everyone's situation in the room here, but I suspect most of us have not faced into the reality of serious lack, going without for an extended period of time. Of course, we, as a church, we're going out on the Bethany Caravan tomorrow, so one of the things we do is we give food to the homeless, to the people who are struggling, who really need food to survive, and so that's something the team are doing just tomorrow. So just keep them in your prayers as they go out and do that. But we live in a very strange time in our world where on the one hand we have this huge problem with people on one hand overeating, and on the other hand we have part of the world who are actually starving. I looked up the stats for just Scotland, and in Scotland apparently a third of people are obese and 2/3 are overweight. And in 2023, over 1 million people faced hunger or food insecurity in Scotland. Though when I saw the stats, I was like, what? And apparently a quarter of children today face some level of hunger or food insecurity in Scotland. Okay, so the food insecurity is a reality for a lot of people in our world. So as we look at our passage today, we need to remember that there are actual physical implications about what we're going to be talking about today as well. We're in this wilderness journey, talking about this journey from the people of God took from Egypt all the way through the wilderness into the promised land. And they lived in a place during that wilderness journey where lack was a real potential. The wilderness is not a great place. We'll put the definition up we used before. The wilderness in the Bible is often a place of testing and danger. It's a place of encounter, so it's a place where God actually meets people. And it's a place where people are changed and transformed. But most simply, the wilderness is a place where life is not abundant. It's the kind of opposite of the garden picture that we looked at before. That actually it's difficult to just sustain life in the wilderness. It requires a lot of effort to find food and kind of the basics of life. And as humans, we have this kind of innate sense that we're not really meant for the wilderness. We're not really meant to live in a place of lack, we actually long for the garden. We long for the promised land. That's the place where we feel like we belong. However, the story in the Bible is that because of our brokenness and our rebellion to God, which the Bible calls sin, we simply are not able to receive the blessings of the garden. Our desires lead us astray, and we long for things that actually damage us. We know the story, I looked at a couple of weeks ago. Adam and Eve were tested in the garden, and unfortunately they failed. They failed to trust God with the provision he'd given them. So they need to learn to trust him in a different place. So they get cast out of the garden. And the challenge in the Bible is you can either learn the lesson in the garden or you can learn the lesson in the wilderness. And I know which one I would rather. But if you don't learn it in the garden, you will learn it in the wilderness. And the wilderness, in many ways, is like a place where God puts us so that our dependence on him is forced. And the thing that happens, though, with humans, because we're made in the image of God and we desire to build good things, what we do is we actually build protections around us in the wilderness. So not long after they get cast out of the garden, they're building communities, they're building cities. And all of these are building walls of protection to protect them from the wilderness. And they create systems, and we still do it today. We create systems to protect us from the wilderness. We try to build little gardens. And as I say, in many ways, this is a good thing. This is the way we're wired as humans, is to create little gardens to improve things where we go. But the problem with that is that when we create in our own efforts things that insulate us from the wilderness, we actually also insulate ourselves often from God as well. The walls we build to protect ourselves from the harshness of life often become the same walls that actually build a wall between us and God. We can become self-reliant in an unhealthy way of God, looking for a life within ourselves rather than a life within God. And this is effectively the journey of the Old Testament, all the highs and the lows and the roller coaster of that, is people continually stepping away from God and trying to build fortresses of protection for themselves rather than relying on God. The question for us is, can we live in the garden and still remain completely dependent on God? Or will life in the garden cause us to think we don't need him? If God puts us in the garden, will we think, oh, we don't need him anymore? Can we live in the garden and remain dependent on God? And like I say, this is just a problem for us today as it was for the ancient people of Israel. Like, we still build safety nets around ourselves. We build all sorts of things in our culture and in our lives that protect us. And we then put our trust, the problem is we then put our trust into these things to keep us safe and protect us. And that could be anything for any of us. Do we put our trust in our pension? Is our trust in our home? Is our trust in our job or in our good health? The challenge of this wilderness moment is, can you learn the lessons that will help us live in the garden and stay dependent on God? Can we live in grace, receiving all that God has for us, or do we step back into striving, trying to make it happen in our own strength? And that's the challenge. And the section of scripture we're going to look at today is where they're supposed to learn this, the people of Israel. And so today we are going to speak directly into this topic of dependence on God. And we're, of course, talking about the bread from heaven. I did originally think I was going to cover all of this in one talk today, and then I saw how long it was getting, and I was like, no, this is going to be 2 talks. So I've spared you the lecture on this section because there's actually loads in it. And so we'll pick up the main passage today, and then there's a secondary passage we'll look at next week. So we're in Exodus 16. If you want to follow along in your own Bibles, we'll also put it on the screen. We're slightly out of sequence with Jo. She was 17 last week, for those that are paying attention. So we've stepped back, and we're now looking at the story of the manna and the quail. So I'll work it through slide by slide, and we'll take a pause after each of them. So we're in Exodus 16. The whole Israelite community set out from Elim and came to the desert of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the 2nd month after they'd come out of Egypt. In the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, "If we had only died by the Lord's hand in Egypt, there we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. But you have brought us into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death." Then the Lord said to Moses, "I will rain down bread from heaven for you. The people are going to go out each day and gather enough for that day. In this way I will test them and see whether they will follow my instruction. On the 6th day they are to prepare what they bring in, and that is to be twice as much as they will gather on the other days." So let's just pause there. So this whole section, once again, the people of God are grumbling. This seems to be the theme throughout this whole section, is the people of God are unhappy. I was reminded of that phrase, you can please some of the people all of the time. You can please all of the people some of the time, but you can't please all of the people all of the time. And the people of God are really unhappy in the wilderness, and they're longing to go back to Egypt. And it's almost like they're chanting, like, "Give us Egypt, give us Egypt." And they're thinking about the meat, they're thinking about the delicious feasting, and forgetting about the slavery. And it's getting bad. They're basically saying, "God, why don't you just kill us back in Egypt rather than drag us through this wilderness?" And there's this sense of kind of the camp is spilling over in anger and frustration. And God overhears their complaining, which is what he tends to do. And he's less than happy with their attitude, but he does respond. Moses and Aaron then gather the people together to address them. And Moses and Aaron are very good. They point out the problem is not with them as leaders, it's God's fault. So they're like, if you're grumbling, you're not grumbling to us, you're grumbling to God himself. And then God's glory shows up in the cloud that's been leading them by the day. So the cloud's right next to the camp, and then God's glory shows up, and then God speaks. So we're skipping a little bit ahead to verse 11. We'll put it on the screen. The Lord said to Moses, I have heard the grumbling of the Israelites. Tell them, at twilight you will eat meat, and in the morning you will be filled with bread. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God. That evening, quail came and covered the camp, and in the morning there was a layer of dew around the camp. And when the dew was gone, thin flakes like frost on the ground appeared on the desert floor. When the Israelites saw it, they said to each other, "What is it?" For they did not know what it was. Moses said to them, "It is the bread the Lord has given you to eat. This is what the Lord has commanded. Everyone is to gather as much as they need. Take an omer for each person you have in your tent." Let's pause again. So that night, the Lord's going to send quail to these small birds that are they migrate in the Middle East. And these little small birds that they can fly, but once they've flown, they're pretty exhausted. So slightly easier to catch than your average bird, I imagine, a bit more like chickens or something. And then when the dew comes, these flakes appear on the ground. And the people don't know what it is. And I find it fascinating because it's like they pray for this and the Lord says, "I'm going to send bread." And then the Lord sends bread, but it's not the kind of bread they had in mind. And it's interesting here, like how often do I pray for something and the Lord answers it and provides for me exactly what I've asked for, but it's not quite what I expected. They're probably thinking, "Where's the wheat?" So we can, get the wheat and make it into bread and, do the old-fashioned bread way, But no, we've got flakes that appear on the ground. And it's quite funny because they say, "What is it?" And then it becomes a bit of a joke because the Hebrew for manna sounds like, "What is it?" So they actually call the bread, "What is it?" So they go out every day and they're like, "Let's collect the what is it." So this becomes the thing. And we read a description later. It says it was like white coriander seed and tasted like wafers made with honey. I don't know how you imagine that. Like wafers made with honey. And then in Numbers, we get even more of a description. So in the book of Numbers, it says it looked like resin, which is a really interesting thing to say. You're like, how do we pull all these pictures together? So it's kind of gummy. It's kind of flaky. It's white. It tastes a little bit like honey. And then somewhere else it talks about it having a hint of olive oil. So it's like, I don't know if any chefs here fancy trying to make up some manna bread. But it's very strange. I remember, like everyone else in COVID times, having a go at making bread. Some of you are, I know, probably expert bread makers in here. I am not. I had a go at making bread just because it was, it was COVID times. We did strange things, didn't we? And so I made this bread, and it wasn't soft and fluffy. It was more like a brick than a loaf. But at least I tried, and it wasn't gummy or flaky or white or like resin. But this is what they're dealing with here. And one of the interesting things I learned just this week was that this reference to the resin, it looks like resin. It's like, seems so odd. The only other place that word for resin is used is in the Garden of Eden. There's the word that's being used for the resin there is like a precious stone. And the only other place it's used is in the Garden of Eden, where it describes the precious stones in the garden. And so that, when you know the Bible, you know these little clues are not there by accident. They're actually trying to point to something. They're saying, this bread that God is providing for you is like a little bit of the garden. In the wilderness, I am going to connect you back to the promises of God, and it's a little bit of garden. So this is like Eden bread, or bread from heaven, as it says here. A little reminder of God's abundant provision. And then they have to collect an omer. I found this description of what an omer was quite hilarious. It says, in traditional Jewish standards of measurement, the omer was equivalent to the volume of 43.2 chicken eggs. Everyone know what that means? 42.3 chicken eggs. Or is also known as 1/10 of an ephah. Anyone know that one? Yeah, 1/10 of an ephah. Or in dry weight, the omer weighed between 1.56 to 1.77 kilograms. The quantity of flour required to separate for the dough offering in the Bible. So I have no idea what that means. But they collected some of it, and we're going to read on in the story. So we're in verse 17 now. The Israelites did as they were told. Some gathered much, some little, and when they measured it by the omer, the one who gathered much did not have too much, and the one who gathered little did not have too little. Everyone had gathered just as much as they needed. There's a little interesting fact here. Whatever they collected, so they all go out to collect it in the morning, and some of them obviously go crazy and just collect loads, and some of them are struggling and maybe don't manage to collect as much. But when they get back and they prepare the bread, they've all got exactly what they need. This is like a little hint that this isn't just a normal thing. God is at work in how all this comes together. And so they end up with this kind of perfect equality in the provision, and it's definitely a miracle. God is providing for them, but he's also testing them. And he says this himself, I will test the people to see what they do. And how well do we think they do? Not great, okay? Verse 19, then Moses said to them, no one is to keep any of it until morning. However, some of them paid no attention to Moses. They kept part of it until morning, but it was full of maggots and began to smell. So Moses was angry with them. You see this theme that keeps going. And obviously, you see this theme throughout Moses' life. Anger actually is a real issue for Moses. That's why he kills an Egyptian. It bubbles up in different places. But I also get his frustration. Being a leader is hard work. And this supernatural bread that God has given them is supposed to only last one day. Its best before date is today. That is the best before of this bread. And the human desire to hoard things and save them up for a rainy day kicks in. And they're like, well, I know he said one day, but what if tomorrow I'm extra hungry? What if I just want a little bit extra tomorrow? And so a few of them are thinking like this. What if one day there's no bread? Maybe I should take it a little bit extra, because what if God doesn't give it tomorrow? Should I maybe have some stored up just in case? Anyone identify with this? Anyone else like this in their life? Maybe I'll just buy 2 of that this now, because then it'll be ready for the next time. Sometimes fear masquerades as wisdom. Verse 21, each morning everyone gathered as much as they needed, and when the sun grew hot, it melted away. On the 6th day, they gathered twice as much, 2 omers. I don't know how many chicken eggs that is, for each person. And the leader of the community came and reported this to Moses. He said to them, this is what the Lord commanded. Tomorrow is to be the day of Sabbath rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. So bake what you want to bake and boil what you want to boil. Save whatever is left and keep it until the morning. So they saved it until the morning as Moses commanded, and it did not stink or get maggots in it. Eat it today, Moses said, because today is a Sabbath to the Lord. You will not find any of it on the ground today. 6 days you are to gather it, but on the 7th day, the Sabbath, there will not be any. Verse 27. Nevertheless, some of the people went out on the 7th day. Guess what? They didn't hear the last bit. Some of the people went out on the 7th day to gather it, but they found none. Surprise. Then the Lord said to Moses, how long will you refuse to keep my commands and my instructions? Bear in mind that the Lord has given you the Sabbath. That is why on the 6th day he gives you bread for 2 days. Everyone is to stay where they are on the 7th day. No one is to go out. So the people rested on the 7th day. Let's pause there again. So we're told that this bread only like the best before is today, except on day 6. On day 6, they're to go out and do double the amount of work. So there's extra work on day 6. And then it's supposed to be no work on day 7th, where this idea of Sabbath is introduced. And the idea of Sabbath is supposed to be a day of delight and rest and enjoying what the Lord had provided. And so that's the basic idea around Sabbath. And so what is this test? It's basically, will you trust me? Will you trust me for the day where there is no manna provided? And in some ways, I think actually resting from work is actually the ultimate sign of trust. Because when we rest from work, we're saying, I can't make it happen. I cannot make it happen. They're supposed to just enjoy the spoils from the days before. It's not like they had to particularly work hard for the manna, but there's less work on the Sabbath. And sometimes working when God says rest can be just as disobedient as resting when God says work. The Sabbath is one of those most radical ideas in the Old Testament. It's like a ceasing of production for one day of the week. A feasting and a delighting in who God is and receiving by grace all that he has given you rather than trying to make things happen. And I think in many ways the Sabbath is supposed to be a picture of what life in Jesus is like today. That we receive the grace that God has given us. Our final verse for today, verse 35, the Israelites ate manna 40 years until they came to a land that was settled. They ate manna until they reached the border of Canaan. 40 years they ate. And this is how they survived. They didn't have to go hunting. They didn't have to do any of that stuff. They ate this strange white resin-like honey wafer bread stuff for 40 years. So that's the main passage on manna. As I say, next week we're going to look a little bit at Numbers 11, where a similar story kind of comes up. It's a different episode, but it also has a different application for us. So what can we say about this passage, this idea of God providing the manna and the quail in the wilderness? Well, there's a lot of similarities to what Joe shared last week, the water from the rock. And there's a kind of key truth around, will we trust God to provide what we need when we need it? And will we trust for God to provide it the way he says he's going to provide it? Or will we bring our own ideas to bear? But what else can it say? Well, the first and perhaps most obvious thing to do is to connect what happens in this passage to the life of Jesus. Because this story of the manna becomes one of those keystone stories throughout the whole Bible story. So it gets referred to again and again. And Jesus' life and his teaching and his miracles all speak directly to this story. So let me kind of just join a few dots for you. So in Matthew's gospel, one of the things Matthew is trying to do is say Jesus is the new Moses. He's trying to say Jesus is, like, you really honor Moses as your teacher. Matthew is saying Jesus is the new Moses. He's the new leader. He's the focus. And so things like on the Sermon on the Mount, what does Jesus do? He climbs a mountain to deliver a new law. There's these little clues that are in there, and it's supposed to mirror Moses going up the mountain to give the 10 Commandments. Instead, we have Jesus, the Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes, all of that. We also then have Jesus feeding the 5,000 and the 4,000. Both of those are supposed to, again, point us directly back to this wilderness provision. Because what happens, of course, thousands of people come out, and we know it's more than 5,000 because that was just the men. But if we include the women and the children, it's even more than that. All these people came out of their villages, and what's outside the villages? Wilderness. They step out of the place of provision into the wilderness to find the voice of the Lord in the wilderness. And what happens? They don't have any food. And so what does Jesus do? He multiplies the food and provides for them. This is supposed to be Jesus basically saying, I am, like Moses, bringing you food, but my food is different. So he multiplies the food. And then in John's gospel, we get this very explicit statement. We'll put this on the screen, John 6. Jesus said to them, very truly I tell you, it is not Moses who has given you the bread from heaven. They're like, what? Surely it is. He says, but it is my Father who gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God, for the bread of God is the bread that comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. Sir, they said, always give us this bread. Then Jesus declared, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry. Whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. And then Jesus basically says, I am the provision of God in the wilderness. Jesus' life then becomes the life by which we sustain ourselves. Not just life in like the bread was a daily thing that they needed every single day. But Jesus is saying, my life is life forever. They will never go hungry again. They will never be thirsty. God has provided in the wilderness one more time and one final time through Jesus. And then, of course, we come to one of the more clear parts of Jesus' story that connects back to the manna, which is the Last Supper, or the meal we call the Eucharist or communion. What has Jesus said? He says, "This is my body that's given for you," and he's holding the bread. What's happening again? This is a connection straight back to this story again. And he's saying, my body given for you is, again, this is bread in the wilderness. This is God providing what you need for life. And he's using life, obviously, in a much bigger sense than just surviving. And Jesus said, "I come that you might have life and have life to its full." This is what the bread symbolizes. And Jesus' death and resurrection then becomes the source of life for all of us. He has come that we might have life. So when we share communion, we're actually, part of what we're doing is remembering that God provides in the wilderness and that God ultimately provided through Jesus, and we don't need to be hungry again. And again, there's one more, probably even more famous aspect of Jesus' life that connects directly into this, and that's from the Lord's Prayer. The Lord's Prayer is rich with wilderness imagery in there as well. You might not have noticed it, but the obvious one is, "Give us today our daily bread." Guess what the daily bread is? It's the manna. What is it? "Give us today our daily bread." That immediately the original hearers would have been like, back in the wilderness, God provided for us. And so we're called, when Jesus gives us this model for prayer, he's saying to us, you need to continue to pray for your daily bread, for the things that sustain you. And I think it's got like a double meaning here. It does mean we can pray for our needs, the things we actually need God to provide for us, and we can trust him as a good father to provide the things that we need in our lives. But it also means to be daily dependent on the life of Jesus. And there's other echoes in the Lord's Prayer of wilderness. The line that says, "Lead us not into temptation." The word that says temptation is actually testing. He's basically saying, don't lead us back into the wilderness. Don't lead us back into the place of testing. Lots of other places we could point to. Psalm 23, the wilderness, like the whole journey, like he prepares a feast for me in the presence of my enemies, though I walk through the valleys. Anyway, all of it, there's lots of parts of it. So what can we say from all of these passages and all of this scripture today on the manna and the quail? And I've just got one very simple challenge for us today, and that's the call to stay dependent. We have to stay dependent on Jesus. The whole wilderness journey can be summarized as God trying to get the people to see that they actually need him to live healthy and good lives. They need his words to guide them. They need his provision to sustain them. And the problem in the garden was that Adam and Eve thought they knew better. They believed the lie of the serpent that there was something God was holding back from them. And rather, they didn't believe that God was a good father, that what he was saying for them to do and not do was because he cared for them and loved them. You know, the serpent persuades Adam and Eve that God is actually insecure about them becoming like him. You know, he says to them, eat of this fruit and you will be like God. And God doesn't want that for you. So the lie right at the beginning was that God doesn't want what's best for you. And so the counter truth that we need to hold on to is God wants the absolute best for you. I sometimes think of Adam and Eve. They're a bit like the children who think you're ruining their fun when you say, don't touch that hot thing. Do you know when you're like, when the kids are like, oh, can I just touch this? And you're like, no, you can't touch it. And they're like, you're ruining all my fun. Like, no, I'm saving us a trip to A&E today, or whatever it is. But that's the picture. We don't believe that God actually has the best for us. And so the message of the manna is, will we depend on God and believe he actually wants the best for us? And again, it's not weekly, not monthly, not annually, but every single day. They were provided for 40 years, which, roughly speaking, is 14,600 days. Every day. And the manna is only fresh for one day. And I think Jesus in the Lord's Prayer is kind of affirming this. Give us today our daily bread. He doesn't say, don't ask for the bread for next week or tomorrow or whatever it might be. Can you give me the bread for the next 6 months and I'll just store it up, Lord. I'll put it in the freezer and that'll keep it good for a while. No, it's daily bread. And the challenge for all of us is that our fears and our insecurities about the future creep in. Maybe it's only me. The fear that we might not have enough. The anxiety that we're not going to be able to sustain our own lives. This is, everyone in our culture today faces into this. And Jesus comes with that simple challenge. Will you ask for daily bread? And we all get nervous. We're like, what if there's not enough tomorrow? And, looking at the news, looking at all the things happening in our world today, it's not difficult to get anxious and worried and uncertain about the future. As you watch the price of your fuel at the petrol station climb up, it's not difficult to be anxious about tomorrow. But Jesus kind of calls us back to almost be childlike and simple and say, give us today our daily bread. And we often learn these kind of habits of fear and anxiety at a very young age. It's the challenge of being a parent is that, we think back in our own childhood, there was probably a time when we were very, very young and we cried out for something and our parents didn't respond immediately. And so we then build into our heads this idea that they probably aren't going to provide. And then we grow up into adults who realize that if we're going to survive, we're going to have to provide for ourselves. We're going to have to fend for ourselves. We're going to have to get smart about how we do things, because if we don't, we might have to go without again. We become independent. And some of that independence that we grow up into is good. But when we relate it to God, it's always bad. When we apply the lessons we've learned from our human parents and we apply them to God, it can lead us into a place of distrust. And the challenge for most of us is that we go, well, God, it's okay. I've covered 95% of things. God, don't worry, I've got a good job. I've got all these sources, excuse me, coming in. And I've got 95% of it covered. If something goes wrong, could you just deal with that bit? So I'm fine, most of the time, Lord. I'm just absolutely fine. I can get by. Oh, something's gone wrong. God, could you help with this bit? And the challenge of the story of the manna is not to exclude him from every aspect of your life. To not have him just as the God who comes in times of trouble. He is the God who comes in the times of trouble, don't get me wrong. And his mercy and his grace is there. But what if we relied on him every day? And this is the challenge. Will we rely on him in the garden? Picture the garden as the days where everything's going fine in your life. And picture the wilderness as the days where everything's gone wrong and everything is broken. And in those days, we call out to God, don't we? But what about in the garden? What about in the garden when things are going well? Do we still call out to him? Do we still depend on him? Because you either learn the lesson in the garden or you learn it in the wilderness. I find this so challenging, even just personally, because it's our fear and our insecurities that come up to the surface and cause us to doubt that God is who he says he is. And maybe you can relate. I'm very good at worrying about things that I'm just very good at worrying about things. And we had a situation just a few months back where things were a little bit financially tight. Don't worry, this isn't an appeal. I'm not about to put a hat out the front. We're absolutely fine. This is more about my mindset. And so it was just a little moment of things are a bit tight. And I got myself into this place of worry and anxiety where I ended up checking the banking app every day. I don't know if anyone's ever gotten to that place where you're like, every day just, I don't know why, it hadn't changed. It was like I would just check the bank. And I realized, I was like, why am I doing this? Why am I checking the bank every day? And the Lord said to me, let's see, I've written it down. Will you stop worrying and start trusting? And I was like, ouch. Will you stop worrying and will you start trusting? And the first step was I had to break the habit. I'm like, I'm not going to be checking my bank. I'm actually not going to check the bank balance for the next week. It'll be fine. And then the next step is, God, well, you're in charge. You can provide. It's not difficult for you. I hand over everything that I worry about to you. You take control. This isn't about being head in the sand about our challenges. This is about being dependent and trusting him. God, you know what we need more than we do, and we leave it with you. He says this again and again and again in the New Testament, and it's simple to read and it's hard to apply. Matthew 6:26. Look at the birds of the air. They do not sow or reap or stow away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they? Can any one of you, by worrying, add a single hour to your life? I've definitely tried. And later, verse 34, therefore do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. One of the challenges of this manna provision in the wilderness is really to become, like I say, like a child again. To receive the provision of the Lord in our lives. To ask him for what we need every day. And to trust his motives, that he actually cares for us, that he actually wants to provide for us. To trust, even in the wilderness, even in the desert, even in the difficult places, that he wants our best. So the question is really, will we let the wilderness teach us this lesson? The times where we're struggling, will we let them teach us to lean into God in a way that shapes us for the garden? That when we step into the promises of God, when things are going well in our lives, that we're still as dependent on him as we were in our hurt, in our pain, in our disappointment. When the promised land arrives, when we step into them, will we forget that God is our source? When we come on to the bit where they actually enter into the promised land, you'll see that's the warning to them. When you step into the promised land, will you receive everything you have as a gift from God? Or will you suddenly think, hey, check me out, I'm so cool. Look at all this stuff I've got. And that's sadly what happens. The people of God step into the promised land and then become arrogant about who they are. Spoiler alert. Because God uses the wilderness to remind us that we really have to depend on him. And the challenge for many of us is that feels like weakness. It feels like weakness to say, I need God every single day. That feels like weakness in our culture to say, I'm so dependent on him. And people say, oh, Christians just believe in God because he's a crutch. Will we depend on him daily for everything we need? And Paul has, again, a very challenging thought for us. Because he says, when I'm weak, he is strong. Let's look at the full verse in 2 Corinthians 12. I'm not quite where Paul is here in these words, but let's read it. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. Why, Paul? For when I am weak, then I am strong. And these are really hard words to kind of come to grips with, because how many of you, when you're being insulted, go, yes, I delight in insults. I'm not there. But what's Paul saying here? He's saying that all of these things that are meant to bring us down actually bring us into God. Any wilderness experience you've walked through is an opportunity for a deeper connection with him. And if you have that perspective, then whatever happens in your life, you will be rooted and grounded in the love of God. Into the promises of God, nothing can touch you. So, to finish today, the real question I have for you is, what do you need from God today? What do you need from God today? What is the daily bread provision you need from him? What is an area where he's saying, just depend on me? Let's just take a moment. Just ask him if there's something that you need. Just ask him for it this morning. God, I thank you that Jesus came to reveal that you're a good father. And we've all had different experiences of what earthly fathers can be. And God, we thank you that you're a perfect father. That every good and perfect gift comes from above. Shift like shadows. And I thank you that when we ask for bread, you do not give us a rock. We ask for fish, you do not give us a snake, Lord. I thank you that you give what we need. And I pray you would teach us what it means to stay dependent on you. In the good times and in the bad. In the wilderness and in the garden. And I thank you that we can hold on to that promise that when we're weak, then we are strong. Because we are in you. I just pray right now for anyone who feels that wilderness moment right now, that you're going through something really difficult. God, I pray that you would meet these people in the wilderness, that you would encounter them like never before. Like Moses at the burning bush. That you would meet with them in their wilderness moment. And you would declare who you are in their lives. I pray for strength for those who are feeling weak today. I thank you that when we're weak, that's when you come and bring your strength. And I pray for anyone feeling weak or burdened this morning, that you would strengthen them and comfort them and come close. And I pray, Father, you, even though you don't send the wilderness, you can meet us in it. And I pray you'd use the wilderness as moments in our lives to transform us and shape us into people who stand for you. Amen.